Hello class, I want to welcome you all to this class on the study of the book of Corinthians. In this video, we shall be covering and studying about the communication between Apostle Paul and the Church of Corinth. For your easy and better understanding, I have summarized the correspondence to 10 stages. So, let's begin. Stage 1. Paul's first visit to Corinth. The first point of contact happened when Paul first arrived in Corinth for the first time, having faced opposition in Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. We read of it in the book of Acts chapter 18 and verse 11. Paul ministered in Corinth for 18 months, probably in AD 51 and 52. There in Corinth he met Priscilla and Aquila, Jews who had recently left Rome. He preached the gospel and planted a church. After local Jewish officials expelled the church from the synagogue, they met in a large house next door that Titus Justus owned. Stage 2. Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians. Soon after establishing the church and his 18 months of stay and ministry, Paul left Corinth and went to Ephesus. From Ephesus, Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians. It was probably written in the first year of his ministry in Ephesus, and roughly 3 to 5 years after the church was established. It's important to note that this first letter is not the letter of 1 Corinthians that is found in our Bible. In other words, the letter of 1 Corinthians that is found in our Bible is actually the second letter written by Paul to the Corinthian church. Now, we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons. This verse suggests that there is another letter which Paul wrote before the 1 Corinthians which is in our Bible. In order that we don't get confused, I would say let's call this first letter as letter A. Now, we don't have much information about this letter A because it was lost, or in other words, not preserved. But some commentators believe that it may have been included in 2 Corinthians. However, what we do know is that it was a hasty one, telling the Corinthians to put things right, and it brought a very negative reaction from the Corinthians. Stage 3. The next stage of communication between Paul and Corinthians happened when Paul received some feedbacks about the church. He received this feedback in two ways. Number 1, Paul received some reports from the church. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1, Paul says it's actually reported. This suggests that Paul had received some report about the church. Again, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 18, Paul says, for to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that. This suggests that Paul heard some report about the church. But the question is, from where? Firstly, a verbal report came from Chloe's household about the affairs of the church. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 11, for it has been reported to me by Chloe's household. Who was Chloe? Chloe was a woman. She was probably a businesswoman. Chloe would have been traveling and have come back to Paul and informed him. Chloe's family were also members of the church in Corinth, for it says Chloe's household. Household in those days were very big. It could number many more than 20 people. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 17, I rejoice, says Paul, at the coming of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaeus. These brethren who had visited Paul in Ephesus had brought him a gift from the church and gave him some news about the Corinthian church. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 18, some have become proud and do not want to listen to God. They seem to have taken objection to Paul's directives. They were people arguing with Paul. Paul is praying with them over and over again. There are tensions between Paul and the Corinthians. The second way Paul received a feedback was when Paul received a letter from the church. The suggestive evidence for this is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, Paul says, about which you wrote. That means they have written a letter to Paul. This letter was probably carried by Stephanus and his friends. This letter was from the whole church as a response to Paul's first letter. The content of this letter was not a friendly question and answer session. There were strong objections. A letter asking also a number of questions about spiritual gifts, marriage, divorce, and other issues. All these events that took place moved Paul to write and send the first letter of Corinthians to them. Stage 4. Paul's second letter to Corinthians. In view of the feedback received by Paul in the form of reported problems and doubts, Paul decides to pen down his second letter, which is actually the first Corinthians, or the second letter written by Paul found in our Bible. Let me stress an important point here. When we read the letter of 1 Corinthians, we have to decide whether each section is a response of Paul to the reported problems from Chloe's household, or is Paul responding to a genuine question or doubt raised by the Corinthians in the letter. For example, in chapter 1, when Paul is writing about the divisions in the church, he is actually responding to a problem in the church. Whereas in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is actually responding to their doubts about marriage and divorce. Another example would be in chapter 5, when Paul is writing about the sexually immoral brother in the church, he is actually responding to a problem in the church. Whereas in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul is actually responding to their doubts about food sacrificed to the idols. We need to carefully study the context along with the text in order to determine whether Paul is responding to a problem in the church, or is Paul responding to a genuine question or doubt, or sometimes even both. Stage 5. Paul sent Timothy to deliver his second letter to the Corinthians. However, later he received a report from Timothy saying that despite his letter, the Corinthians were worse than ever. So Paul went to Corinth. Stage 6. In stage 6, Paul did a short and second visit to Corinth, as he had indicated he would. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 6 says, "And perhaps I will stay with you, or even spend winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I go." However, Paul was not able to spend the winter with them. He was forewarned from Timothy that the Corinthians had not fully appreciated even his second letter. Hence, what was originally planned as a positive time ended up being Paul's painful visit. It was a short and painful visit because it was done in haste. He went directly to Corinth, bypassing Macedonia, and was much shorter than he had planned. Secondly, it was painful because of a particular man in the church who was acting immorally in the church. Number 3, this man was creating doubts among the congregation about Paul's apostolic authority. After a certain time, certain Jews came into the church and began to stir up trouble, which in turn required a visit from the Apostle Paul. Stage 7. Paul's second visit was a disaster and had to leave very soon. After the painful visit, Paul returned to Ephesus. The church self-designated leaders, even who called them apostles, insulted him and did not want him in Corinth. Because of his humiliation at Corinth, Paul wrote a severe letter demanding that the church should deal with this problem maker. So he sent a severe and tearful third letter. It came to be known as the severe letter. It was a very hot letter, which he acknowledges was very severe. It was apparently carried by Titus. Unfortunately, the third letter was also lost. Stage 8. Report from Titus. In the meantime, Paul was facing a difficult time in Ephesus, possibly the riot referred to in Acts chapter 20. Paul, on the way, he stopped at Troas, intending to meet Titus there on his way back from Corinth. But he could not find Titus and sailed for Macedonia without him. Paul left for Macedonia in order to collect money for the churches there. At this point, he fell ill. While Paul was recovering, Titus arrived in Macedonia and gave Paul a report describing the effect of his letter on the Corinthians. Paul met Titus in Macedonia and learned from him that the Corinthians are getting straightened out. In his report, Paul is made aware of new problems, personal attacks, etc. taking place, and he writes 2 Corinthians to deal with these new issues. Stage 9. In stage 9, while in Macedonia, Paul writes his fourth letter to Corinthians, which is the 2 Corinthians in our Bible. He gives this letter to Titus for delivery. Paul was so pleased he sent a fourth letter, especially after he had written a third and severe letter. Stage 10. After writing his fourth letter to the Corinthians, which is the 2 Corinthians in our Bible, Paul made a third and a final visit to the Corinthian church. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 14, Paul says, "Here I am, ready to come to you this third time, but I will not be a burden, because I do not want what is yours but you." So finally, Paul again visits the Corinthians. This would now be his third visit to these people. If this construction of events and communication between Paul and the Corinthian church is correct, then Paul visited Corinth 3 times. Paul wrote 4 letters to the Corinthians. The second and fourth letter has been preserved in our Bible. Thank you. See you in the next class. God bless.